a slow, underpowered van used to be one of the most potent symbols in modern history. Not because of what it could achieve, but rather because of what it couldn't. It was never intended for the Volkswagen Type 2 to spearhead a revolution. It had an engine that was not powerful enough for its own weight, and it trailed on roads and labored on slopes. Nevertheless, this was the same machine that traveled across continents, transported whole families into uncharted territory, and in some way came to represent freedom. The true question is not why it got well known, but rather how a car with many drawbacks became something that people are still unable to forget. You had to go back to a Europe that was still in the process of reconstruction in order to comprehend that contradiction. Scarcity characterized the late 1940s. Materials were scarce, economies were erratic, and factories were ruined. Volkswagen's top goal in Germany was to create straightforward, reasonably priced cars that would enable people to relocate. That's what the Beetle was already doing. However, something strange was taking place within the plant. Using surplus Beetle parts, workers had started building their own transport machines. These weren't official cars. They served as crude, homemade platforms for moving parts about the production floor. They were not planned by a design team. They had no marketing plan to support them. However, they resolved a genuine issue. Ben Pon, a Dutch importer, saw this equipment when he visited the facility around this period. What he observed was an idea that needed further development rather than merely a short-term fix. He drew a straightforward concept, a box-shaped van constructed on top of the mechanical foundation of the Beetle. The Volkswagen Type 2, which was first introduced in 1950, was developed from that sketch. It seems almost too easy to be significant at first. A circular body, a flat front, and little ornamentation. Beneath that simplicity, however, were a number of engineering choices that would determine both its achievements and its challenges. The Type 2's engine placement was one of its best-kept secrets. It had an air-cooled, rear-mounted engine, just like the Beetle. Although this decision simplified production and decreased complexity, it also brought about significant restrictions. The engine struggled under severe loads and only produced a moderate amount of power. The van needed patience when it was completely loaded, especially on hills. This was not a fast car. It was intended to work. However, that choice had an odd benefit. Because the air-cooled engine was so basic, fewer parts could break. There were fewer parts that needed specialist maintenance, no complicated cooling system, and no radiator. This had an impact in isolated places. Owners could fix the car on their own, frequently with simple equipment. However, there was a price for that same simplicity. In harsh climates, heat management was uneven. Careful attention was needed on long trips. Most significantly, by today's standards, the vehicle's structure provided very little protection. In its early years, safety was not a top priority. The Type 2's balance was another undiscovered feature. Handling could become unpredictable because the engine is in the back and the cargo is frequently dispersed unevenly. Drivers have to change. It required awareness, tolerance, and a certain amount of deference. You couldn't take this car for granted. Despite these difficulties, an unforeseen development started to take place. The Type 2 began to gain popularity as a much more intimate vehicle as well as a commercial one. It was employed for labor in Europe. It was a daily necessity for craftsmen, small businesses, and delivery services. However, it discovered an entirely new identity when it arrived in the United States. It started to be connected with exploration, travel, and an increasing desire to abandon regimented lifestyles. Volkswagen never intended for this change to occur. It happened organically. One of the most significant facts about its legacy is found here. The Volkswagen Type 2's strength and sophistication did not make it iconic. Because it made people slow down, it became famous. Travel took more time. It became important to stop. Discussions went on for longer. Traveling became a different experience. Families adjusted to the small area. Long drives across strange places were shared by friends. For many, it was more than just a means of transportation. It was an integral aspect of their lives. However, there were sometimes overlooked truths hidden underneath such memories. Rust became a recurring problem, particularly in areas with severe weather. Many of these cars become irreparably damaged over time. Only a small portion of what once existed is represented by what is left now. Performance restrictions also didn't change. Improvements were incremental rather than revolutionary, even in later iterations. The Type 2 stuck to its original concept while rivals adopted more potent engines and contemporary design. T was both a strength and a weakness because of that loyalty. Volkswagen's identity was significantly shaped by the Type 2. It proved, together with the Beetle, that straightforward engineering could succeed on a global scale. It made it possible for the company to attract consumers from various backgrounds and grow into new areas. However, it became more challenging to retain that simplicity when expectations changed. Automobile design was evolving by the late 1960s and early 1970s. Safety requirements were getting better. Under tough circumstances, customers anticipated improved performance, greater comfort, and greater dependability. Even while it was still adored, the Type 2 started to age. Volkswagen provided changes in response. The engines had a little greater power. Interiors got more sophisticated. However, the basic design stayed true to its initial idea. And that idea was starting to lag behind. Endurance is one of the story's most distinctive features. The Type 2 has been known to traverse continents, mountains, deserts, and isolated areas. These were difficult journeys. There were breakdowns. There were many repairs. However, it was able to continue because of the vehicle's simplicity. Problems were not avoided. It made it through them. Its reputation was shaped by this tenacity. Not as a perfect machine, but as one that, with the right maintenance, could continue to function. But no design can stay the same forever. Global priorities were altered by the energy crisis of the 1970s. Both efficiency and inventiveness gained importance. Manufacturers started spending money on innovative technologies. Modern cooling systems, enhanced safety structures, and front-engine layouts became commonplace. The air-cooled, rear-engine design of the Type 2 was no longer competitive, and Germany, production steadily changed before coming to a stop. However, the narrative did not end there. The Type 2 was manufactured for decades in nations like Brazil, where its simplicity was still prized. Change was unavoidable even then. By 2013, new safety standards demanded additions that the original design was unable to incorporate without becoming unrecognizable. The world had progressed beyond what the car could provide in its original form, which is why the production line eventually stopped. Not because demand vanished. This brings us to the last, frequently misinterpreted point. Despite its failure, the Volkswagen Type 2 did not disappear. It went beyond what it was intended to be. Its narrative is one of steady transition rather than abrupt fall. A device designed for one time period that persisted into another, changing just enough to endure but never completely. The remaining examples are now more than simply historical artifacts. They stand for an alternative style of design in which simplicity is seen as a solution rather than a compromise, where experiences were shaped rather than constrained by limits. Every car that has survived has remnants of its history. Mechanical noises, faded paint, and worn interiors all tell a tale. These are not flaws. They serve as proof of use, completed journeys, and interconnected lifestyles. And maybe that's why people are still interested in the Volkswagen Type 2. It became relatable, not because it was the best at anything. It was never flawless. It was never quick. It was never as innovative as contemporary automobiles strive to be. However, it was genuine. And it gets more difficult to find that kind of honesty in a world that is moving more quickly. You can tell that it represents more than simply its design if you've ever encountered one or even just watched one go by. It symbolizes a period of time when movement had a distinct meaning. There are many more cars like this, each carrying their own unwritten truth, waiting to be remembered, so it could be worthwhile to stay in touch if stories like these, quiet, honest, and based on actual history, still hold significance for you.